In spite of the tumult and uncertainty around British politics, we're going to try and look ahead now at what to look for in the days ahead. Jim Pickard is chief political correspondent for the Financial Times. It's hard to imagine how a withdrawal agreement that's been rejected twice before would be approved this time round. What are the more likely scenarios looking at the week ahead here?
So the problem that the Prime Minister has, Theresa May, is that she's been doing a game of chicken for the last few months against two political enemies. On the one side, she's got the people who want a much harder Brexit. They want to leave with no deal. And on the other side of the equation, she's got people, primarily members of the opposition Labour Party, who are terrified of leaving without any deal at all, what's called a hard Brexit, with no agreement whatsoever with the EU. And she's been trying to threaten the people who want a hard Brexit with no Brexit, and she's been trying to threaten the people who are worried about no deal with no deal. And what has happened so far is that every time she moves in one direction, then it reassures the other side that they don't need to vote for her. And when she moves back the other way, then the other people feel liberated to vote down her deal as well. So the problem we've got going into the vote next week, which people are expecting probably on Tuesday, although it hasn't yet been nailed down, is that she still doesn't have the numbers. She was defeated, remember, by 250 votes in January. She was defeated again by 149 votes only last week. And we haven't seen enough of a shift in her direction. If anything, we're starting to see some Conservative MPs from her party actually moving away from the deal, which is the last thing she needs right now.
So are there possible amendments that would go forward? I mean, what's the other alternative besides walking off the cliff here?
So what we're seeing at the moment is an attempt by the House of Commons to seize control of the process from the government. And several MPs have tried before to do this. It looks like it's more likely to happen next week, where these MPs are seeking to do something called indicative votes, whereby it would be an opportunity to put half a dozen different options in front of the House of Commons and see if there is a majority for any one way forward. Now, we know that there's majorities against all sorts of different options, but what is the one thing that could possibly be more popular than the Theresa May deal? Now, the government has indicated that they will do some form of indicative votes next week, but there's a lot of negotiation going on at the moment about how that might work and when it could happen. And most importantly, if they do vote for some alternative to the May deal, will Theresa May accept that as government policy? Not necessarily.
What does all of this mean for Theresa May? Will she last the week, do you think?
The first thing to say is that she's never been a hugely popular Prime Minister, even in her own party. When she became leader over 2 years ago, it was primarily because of what she wasn't. She wasn't a hardcore Brexiteer. She wasn't a hardcore Remainer. And her support was quite wide, but it was always very shallow. She's not someone who has huge personal charisma or magnetism that brings loads of politicians behind her, and she doesn't have a kind of Praetorian Guard of MPs. Now, the chatter in Westminster this week is incredibly hostile. MPs have said to her face that she probably needs to go pretty soon. MPs have been saying to the whips, who control party discipline, that she might have to promise her own departure as a condition for people voting for her deal. And she has rarely looked more unpopular. But the only thing to say is that they did try and pull off a coup last December and fail. And under the formal procedures of the Conservative Party, they can't have another go at that until next December because they have to wait for a year. And I've been covering the British Parliament for long enough to know that even if loads of your colleagues want to take you out, it doesn't necessarily mean that your career as Prime Minister is over. And I remember Gordon Brown, the previous Labour Prime Minister, in I think around 2009, where you had loads of cabinet ministers resigning, loads of ministers resigning, people begging him to leave, and he just dug in and said, no, I'm not going anywhere. And in theory, Theresa May could just carry on regardless for quite a while.
You know, I know it's sometimes unfair to ask political reporters if they are betters, but are you prepared to sort of speculate about whether or not, in fact, Britain is walking off this Brexit cliff?
I think if we've learned one thing covering British politics in recent years, it's that predictions, especially bets, are a very risky thing to do. all we can do is guide people as to what the prevailing wind is on any one day. And all I would say at the moment is that no-deal Brexit, which a few months ago looked incredibly unlikely, is now looking much more of a potential prospect. I've been talking to a lot of business groups today who say that their members are really worried about this, especially manufacturers who have just-in-time delivery chains with European countries, where if you introduce checks at the border or customs declaration or any kind of delay, it totally damages that model, and they are terrified of leaving with no deal at all. But a lot of Conservative MPs see a no-deal Brexit as what they would call a clean Brexit, or they sort of see in it the kind of seeds of Britain's freedom from the European bureaucracy. And you were asking about predictions. I think at the moment the central view is that Brexit will be delayed by quite a while, possibly for up to a year, but do not discount the possibility of a very disruptive no deal.
We'll be watching. Thank you very much for your insight on this.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.